A quarantine is, in effect, an abuser's dream. It takes the physical and emotional distance away, cutting off virtually all sources of safety and retreat from the victim. But I want to start off with a story from before the COVID-19 lockdown. This is Isabel's story of intimate partner abuse, and I'm sharing this because it has so many similarities with others that have been shared throughout the pandemic. It's interesting to note the ways in which Isabel was able to find respite and escape, and to ultimately think about how this wasn't possible for so many victims during the lockdown. I think it's eye-opening when considering the ways in which her feelings of being trapped and feeling like a prisoner in her own home actively reflect the isolation of the pandemic, even when she had the out and was physically able to leave. So, this is part of Isabel's story. I was married and I was unhappy. He was violent and didn't treat me right, and he didn't treat my family right either. He got nasty and nastier. Every day, things just got worse. When things got pretty bad, I managed and coped day by day by trying to ignore him. I would do my own thing at home, trying to ignore him. If he started nagging at me, I could always get away in the car and I could go for a drive or go visit mom's place or friends, just to get away from him. When I got back home, he would be sweet for a while and then he would be back to the old nasty person. When we were together, he was very strict about who I went out with. I couldn't easily go out with other people, girls or guys. I had no life. I felt I was a prisoner in my own home. If I did go out, it was only with him or with family. I felt like a dog on a chain and I couldn't get it off. When he went out to play his sport, I would sit up and wait for him as wives and husbands do for each other. Half the time he would come home and say, "Why are you up?" And I would think to myself, I'm just doing what couples do for each other. Isabel's story goes on to talk about how she ended up finding help through a women's disability center, and she ends the story with some advice for others. My advice to other women is to turn to family and friends. I did. If you don't have family you can rely on, then find someone you trust to talk to. Go to a women's service. They understand and are there to help you. My work sent me to a relationship center for counseling, and they told me about the local domestic violence services. Women with disabilities need to know when to go and get help.
The last time Stacy's boyfriend strangled her, she nearly died. I woke up, I just felt numb. My whole body was just like, am I here? Am I dead? She recalled thinking after she regained consciousness. Stacy said he attacked her because she wouldn't fix him something to eat, so he put his hands around her neck and started to squeeze, in the living room in front of her kids. Kara is identifying her only as Stacy to protect her identity, and while we have checked facts in her story, domestic violence doesn't leave a complete record, so this is her account of the events. Stacy said when her 7-year-old daughter tried to stop the assault with her tiny, balled-up fists, he paused the strangulation long enough to drag Stacy by her hair to a bedroom. She kicked out a window, hoping someone outside might hear and come help. Nobody did. He continued to strangle her. She tried to scream. He put a pillow over her face, and she lost consciousness. He strangled me before, but not to where I blacked out, where I urinated on myself, she said. I woke up, and just like in a daze, and I was like, I have to get out of this house. I have to leave. This was late April. The whole state was locked down because of the coronavirus. Stacy was faced with the same terrible choice that has confronted abuse victims since the pandemic upended its life. Flee from abuse and violence or stay home to avoid COVID-19. I had to make a decision, Stacy said. Should I leave right now during this pandemic and we could get possibly sick, or I need to go and save my life and my kids? It's a decision that women and men facing violence at home have had to make, as the coronavirus has added pressure to already abusive home lives.
As people continue to limit activities outside the home, victims are more exposed to their abusive partners, who may use the coronavirus as a tool to further control their victim and restrict their movements. Work and social lives remain disrupted, and many victims first report abuse to coworkers and friends. Increased health anxieties, coupled with economic pressure, are stressors that can act as added fuel to already combustible relationships. Karen Jacob, who runs Safe Haven in Tarrant County, Texas, said, "That's why on social media, we've constantly been telling people check on your friends. You're not going to see people at church. You're not going to see people at the grocery store or at the mall or at a party." In March, as Texas began to hunker down and counties ratcheted up restrictions, Safe Haven's crisis hotline saw a dramatic spike in calls from victims who saw a closing window of opportunity to get help before shelter-in-place orders trapped them at home with their abusers. When the orders went into effect, calls to the hotline dropped by nearly half, a terrifying sign for Jacob, who knew that this didn't signal a reduction of abuse, but an inability for the abused to call for help. Jacob said two consistent trends have remained. First, caseworkers are seeing more instances where people don't make it to prearranged pickup points, a sign it's more difficult to get away with abusers at home. The other trend, the calls coming in are more often describing more violent, higher risk situations. For Stacy, moving into the shelter has given her a chance to focus on her future and building a better life for her family. Her abuser made her feel small, she said, and she felt like she lost sight of herself and her value. Now she's embracing the counseling at Safe Haven and is planning to go back to school in the fall. "I found myself once I got here, and I'm happy I came here because I'm on a whole new journey and trying to fix myself again," she said. "Like I got the old me back."
Yes and no. Sometimes for periods, yes, it got worse at times. But that's because they would be home for weeks on end. But no for others. At one point, they left and dipped for weeks, so when they were there, it was usually worse. I'd say that was from March to June, the first couple months. After that, it was pretty hit or miss. More frequently, but not necessarily higher intensity. Obviously, like a couple of moments, it was higher in intensity, but generally, it was a frequency thing. And yes, the pandemic made it worse. Yes, I got personal support, but not organizational support. During quarantine, there were no support sources. After quarantine, there were more support sources. Okay, here's what I'll say. I think what makes it difficult is because often when you report abuse, the assumption is that you want to do something about it. For some people, that would cause a worse outcome than just dealing with the abuse. So, if there could be a system that allows you to report abuse, receive support, and allow for a smoother transition out of an abusive situation, I think that would be more helpful and more effective for a good chunk of people. Because otherwise, you have people in the situation of like they report it, someone shows up at their house, and it's like, hey, we got a report for abuse. And then the abuser's like, what is this? And then they're like, nope, nothing going on. Then they leave, and it gets worse. There are a couple things that I think that I gathered from that interview. I think just from research alone and the interview as well, that at the beginning of the pandemic, the concentration on COVID-19 distracted from domestic abuse. Avenues for support completely shut off, and that led to worsening situations at home for the duration of the lockdown and maybe even beyond. What I fear is that in the future, these issues won't be addressed during other pandemic or war or whatever it may be, and that progress made in providing the support has been erased. It may just be because of my ignorance, but I have yet to hear about advocacy for support for domestic abuse survivors from major media conglomerates. How can this issue be addressed if millions of Americans aren't even aware of how the pandemic exacerbated this issue? Hopefully, as we continue to navigate the pandemic, more awareness will be raised regarding the worsened horrors of abuse. This way, steps can be taken to make reporting abuse safer and more effective, eliciting a more efficient response to abuse. While domestic abuse will never be fully erased from our society, I think how we deal with abuse can save multitudes of people from ever experiencing this horror again.
Speak, could you start by introducing yourself and explaining what it is you do? Yeah, so I am the assistant director of the Gene Crow Advocacy Center, and we call it the JCAC. That is our court-based advocacy center. We are a family justice center, one of two in Nashville under the Office of Family Safety. We work with victims of interpersonal violence, and that means domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, child abuse, things like that.
Okay, great. And so how would you say that your job has changed since the pandemic?
Well, because of the pandemic, we had to find a way that we could still service our clients and keep them safe as well as ourselves. A lot of family justice centers around the country had to shut down. We actually stayed open throughout the pandemic. We just had to figure out a new way to do it. So our role changed that in a way that we became more accessible in a way that we didn't think we could before. We actually, obviously, a lot of people had to go remote, as we did too. Even though we kept our center open to walk-ins, we found a way to have our advocates work remotely with clients. And not only that, but we found a way to provide our resources remotely, even orders of protection. So in a positive way, we found a way to become more accessible because of COVID to those who may not have even been able to come to our center before. In a negative way, our job has changed in the fact that we have, I don't want to say struggled, but the resources aren't as plentiful as they were pre-COVID, if that makes sense. So there were more support groups, more places that we could provide or refer people to. That has changed significantly with COVID. So our job has changed in the sense of where we're having to try to find new ways for certain services and new avenues for clients.
So what would you say, just to kind of springboard off of what you were just saying there, so what would you say, or who constitutes the majority of your client base, and what sort of resources do you think is most important to provide to them?
You mean who is in like gender or just in general?
Yeah, just in general, like just demographics. Have you seen any demographic shifts over the pandemic too?
Our majority of our clients are adult women. And the main resources that we provide, order protections, safety planning, and then a big community or resource that the community needs, which also has grown significantly since COVID, is financial resources. We try to refer to a lot of different financial resources and housing, if we can, yeah.
So do any men ever come into your center at all? Like, do you guys provide services to everyone?
Yes, we do. Men come in. Our numbers are obviously, it's more women that are our clients, but yes, we do have male clients as well. We're very inclusive, so we have women, men, LGBTQ plus, yeah.
Okay, great. That's great.
We do not provide services to children, but we do try to refer to children-based organizations.
Okay, gotcha. So, in your opinion, just like looking at the cases that you've seen since the pandemic, do you think there's been a change in, I don't really know how to phrase this, not domestic violence, but like the sort of, like the reasons why people are coming in?
Yes, it's hard to explain, and I don't have any statistics to really back this up. But in my opinion, it seemed that obviously the cases that we see, a lot of them are always severe and high risk. But it seems that they have increased in the severity, in my opinion. And it could be because so many people were trapped at home that now there's way more people that are seeking resources than would have if COVID and the pandemic hadn't happened. That could be it. So it may be that this was happening. It's just that we are seeing more people than we probably would have seen had it not been for COVID.
Okay, gotcha. And would you say that I know you said that you are more accessible over the pandemic just because you guys have your services online, obviously, but just because like the nature of the pandemic is that people are stuck at home, do you think it's become in a way like more difficult for people to report this kind of thing? So, like if they're stuck with their abusers?
Early on in the pandemic, yes. I think it was tricky for some people to try to figure out how to seek services
Mm-hmm.
when everyone was stuck at home, and even, not even just the abusers, when the kids are stuck at home and trying to get the services you need with children running around or things like that. That was tricky when people, because, a lot of times we have clients who will wait until they go to work or go to the gym, church, somewhere else. So when they couldn't do that, that was something we worked on trying to figure out. It was really difficult. We actually started to do, we could always text and email, but we really utilized text and email a lot once COVID hit.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's great. My only last question for you is, what do you think is the most profound way that COVID will impact what you do going forward?
In my opinion, the most profound way is the remote services that we have now figured out how to use. It's not something that we use every day because we are back in person, and obviously we would prefer to serve clients in person because you get more of that connection. But for the clients that maybe didn't have transportation or couldn't leave home or couldn't leave work, or they worked certain hours that we weren't open or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
This pandemic, once we figured out how to do all these services remotely, has just changed that game completely, because we can all they need is internet access and an email, and we can do anything that we would do in person, pretty much.
That's great.
Besides the obviously the connection
Mm-hmm.
in person.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for answering all my questions. Is there anything else that you would like to say?
I think that I love what y'all are doing, first of all.
Thank you.
But I think COVID, obviously, we know the statistics and how much more dangerous it was for victims of domestic violence with COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the number one issue. But I do also think that COVID had helped bring more attention to domestic violence, because that was such an issue that people were stuck in their homes with their abusers.
Mm-hmm.
And it did force us as providers to think outside of the box and find new ways to help our clients that we probably would not have been able to imagine prior to a pandemic.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate what you do. My roommate works with you, and I know how passionate she is about it. So I guess.
Yes, Julia. I love Julia.
I also love Julia. But yeah, thank you so much for everything. It means a lot that you would take the time out of your day to talk with me.
No problem. Thank you so much for being flexible.